Welcome friends to the Secret Doctrine webinar. This is our third class and today we are going to finish with stanza 7 from the first volume. In the second part of the series we are going to explore some shlokas from the second volume, which elaborates on the subject that we are going through right now. But before we proceed with stanza 7, let us go back to study a couple of shlokas from stanza 6. In the previous series, I said that there were two shlokas that appear to be out of place. Blavatsky recognizes that these two shlokas break the continuity of what the stanza 6 is saying, but she said that it was necessary to place them there. In the way that I see it, these two shlokas are better here. They follow more the story that the stanza 7 is talking about. So we will read them now and then proceed with the stanza 7. So far in the stanza, we have seen how the monad, the divine spark, evolved at the beginning of this planetary chain through the different kingdoms of nature. This was already a human monad, but it has to experience in a new planetary chain the different kingdoms before it can proceed with the human evolution. So we stopped at the point where the body, a human form, is generated by the sixth order of celestial beings and by the seventh, and the point where the fifth order of celestial beings have to come and help to incarnate in these bodies, or to awaken the mind of the monads that are incarnating in these bodies. We are going to see all this in more detail in the second part of this series. But this is the point where we are going to resume these two shlokas from stanza 6. So stanza 6, shloka 5 says, "At the fourth," and Blavatsky adds, "round or revolution of life and being around the 7 smaller wheels." So at the fourth round, the sons are told to create their images. 1/3 refuses, 2/3 obey. So let's start with the first statement. At the fourth round or revolution of life and being around the 7 smaller wheels. So the 7 smaller wheels are the 7 planets or spheres or globes that constitute our planetary chain. And Blavatsky says, that which is meant by the qualification the fourth is explained as the fourth round only on the authority of the commentaries. It can equally mean fourth eternity as fourth round, or even the fourth our globe. For as will repeatedly be shown, our planet is the fourth sphere on the fourth or lowest plane of material life. So first here we have a feature of the shlokas in their symbolic language. The original shloka says simply at the fourth. And then according to the context, the student has to try to figure out whether it is the fourth round, the fourth planet, the fourth plane, as Blavatsky says. This is because, as we have explained in the past, the shlokas are a kind of mathematical formula, if we want to put it that way. Actually, Blavatsky mentions this. And that formula can be applied to explain nature processes or natural processes on different levels. So if the language is too specific, then you can apply it only to that specific process. But because nature follows the same pattern, when the language is vaguer, is more symbolic, it's more open, then you can apply to different processes, different planes, different times in the evolution of the cosmos. And that, of course, adds a difficulty when the student has to try to understand the meaning of the shlokas, but it gives the shlokas a lot of flexibility. So Blavatsky says that there are some commentaries to the shlokas that Blavatsky had access, and she says in the commentary they explained that in the current context of what we are exploring right now, this fourth means the fourth round. Now, the second interesting point here is the special place of number 4 in this particular model. Here we have a diagram of the planetary chain that we have shown several times before. So there are the number 4 is present in different ways. For example, the Earth is the 4th globe in this chain of spheres. We have the first one, second, third, fourth, and then beyond the Earth is the 5th, 6th, and 7th. So number 4 can be referring to the Earth. Now, these 7 globes are arranged, as we explored in a previous series, on the 4 lower planes of the cosmos. The Earth in particular being on the lowest of them, on the 4th. These 4 planes is what in Kabbalah, at least according to Blavatsky's interpretation, this is called the tetragrammaton. The tetragrammaton, which means the 4 letters that compose the name of the deity, is the field of cosmic evolution, or at least the cosmic evolution that we can think of as being related to differentiation and separation and form, because the 3 higher planes are beyond what, at least at this point, we can conceive of. They look like a spiritual unity to us. So you can see that the 4 may refer to the Earth, to the planes, or also to the rounds. Remember, we said that evolution goes around this planetary chain, these globes, 7 times. So what Blavatsky is saying is that this word refers to the 4th revolution around these globes. And this is what she explains. It so happens that we are in the 4th round right now, at the middle point of which the perfect equilibrium between spirit and matter had to take place. So at this point, we are not only in the 4th lower plane, on the 4th globe, but we are also on the 4th round of evolution out of 7 around this planetary chain. And this is where, according to Blavatsky and her teachers, spirit and matter are in equilibrium. That doesn't mean balance. It means that neither matter is stronger than spirit, nor the other way around. When matter is stronger than spirit, as it is, for example, in the mineral kingdom, there is, of course, no conflict. Spirit is dormant. When spirit is stronger than matter, as it may be in the Buddhas, there is no conflict either. But when spirit and matter both have a similar strength, then there is conflict between these two tendencies. And this is the cycle in which we are at the moment. We are in an evolutionary cycle where both powers are in conflict with each other. And because we have just passed the middle of that cycle, we are beginning to enter into the ascending arc of evolution. The first arc of evolution is descending into materiality. Now we are just out of the lowest point, beginning to ascend again. Now, when we were at the lowest point is when the suns, referring to a certain order of celestial beings, are told to create. And that's what we are going to explore in these two shlokas that come from stanza 6. So the sons are told to create their images. 1/3 refuses, 2/3 obey. And there is a quote from a commentary to the stanzas of Xian. The holy youths, the gods, refused to multiply and create species after their likeness, after their kind. They are not fit forms or rupas for us, they said. They have to grow. So they refuse to enter the chayas, the shadows or images of their inferiors. Thus had selfish feeling prevailed from the beginning, even among the gods, and they fell under the eye of the karmic lipikas. We are going to see all this in far more detail in the second part of this series. But at some point when they had to get involved with the evolution of physical humanity, they are told to get involved in this, and they refuse because they say that the forms, that the physical bodies of this very early humanity, which was hardly different from animals, the forms, they said, have to grow, has to evolve, have to improve. And they refused to enter into these forms. That were the chayas, shadows or images. Remember, we said that the sixth order of celestial beings creates an ethereal body, this astral body or astral image, which little by little begins to be solidified by the nature spirits. So these dhyanis, these gods, these celestial beings, refuse to enter into these early bodies because they say that they are not ready, that they are not good enough for them to incarnate. Now, the commentary says that in doing so, there is some kind of selfish feeling. So the question is, can celestial beings have these selfish feelings? Let's see what Blavatsky says first about the process that we are discussing right now. She says, powers, pure essences that were told to create is not only one of the most hidden secrets of nature, that of generation, but likewise a divine function that involves that other religious, or rather dogmatic, mystery, the fall of the angels, as it is called. So this has to do with this idea of the fall of the angels. As we are going to see, there are several falls. Some of them are natural, some of them are an act of self-sacrifice, and some of them are a mistake. So this all has to do with the general idea of the fall. And she says, it has already been stated that to become a self-conscious spirit, so the spirit would be the monad, in order to develop self-consciousness in that monad, the spirit must pass, or the monad must pass, through every cycle of being, culminating in its highest point on earth in man. So the monad has to go through the mineral kingdom, vegetable, animal, and the highest of the kingdoms on earth, because there are higher kingdoms than human beings, but these are celestial beings. So the highest point on earth is a human being. Now, it is a universal tradition, she says, that before the physiological fall, the propagation of one's kind, whether human or animal, took place through the will of the creators or of their progeny. This was the fall of spirit into generation, not the fall of mortal man. So she talks about two falls here, the fall of the spirit and then the fall of the mortal man. Now, the fall of the spirit is simply this engaging of the celestial beings and the engaging into a material experience. So this is when the angels fall into generation, into being born and reproduce. And then there is the fall of the mortal man, which refers to something slightly different. We will see all this better in the second part. But at the beginning, human beings and animals were not quite material. They were still more ethereal, Blavatsky says. And they didn't reproduce by sexual means because their bodies were not really dense and material. So they could reproduce more like in a kind of transition or duplication like we see with cells, for example. When we have two cells, they just divide. And that seems to be the way that at the very early stages of human and animal evolution, reproduction took place. So when human beings become physical and they separate into sexes, then that is also called a fall, in the sense that now reproduction has to proceed by physical means. So there are two falls here, as I was saying, just to summarize: the fall of the spirit into matter, and then the fall of the material human being into generation, into physical reproduction. Now, the shloka says that 1/3 of the celestial beings refused to incarnate or to engage in the generation of human beings. Now, Blavatsky was asked, did these beings that refused to incarnate know they were doing wrong? And Blavatsky says, I suppose they did, but it was disagreeable to imprison themselves into those bodies once more. And they delayed and delayed. They do belong to the divine hierarchy because they had been men in the preceding Manvantara. Now, whether it was on this earth or on other earths, I do not know, but they were manus, thinking beings. So let us see two things here. First, you can see how good and evil is relative according to the stage of evolution. This we can even see in the psychological growth of a child, for example. For a child, it is good to generate a self-centered sense of I-ness. The child begins to develop these ideas of mine and me and what I want. If there is some problem in the growth of the child and the child doesn't develop that ego, then in most cases that person has a lot of difficulties dealing with the world, with people, with situations. So there is a time to develop an ego, but then as the child grows up in a healthy and wise adult, that ego should be transcended as much as possible. So there is a right time to generate an ego, and there is a right time to go beyond the ego. So the same with being spiritual or material. At the point of evolution that we are exploring right now, when the wave of evolution was going into matter, what was right was to become more material. What was wrong is to aspire to remain spiritual. So these celestial beings that were on the spiritual planes, they didn't want to engage in this experience of being material, of being embodied. They wanted to remain spiritual, pure, in a meditative state. And that was a mistake at that point in evolution. And at this point in evolution, that's what we need or the direction in which we need to go. So today, what was wrong at that point in evolution is what becomes our goal at this point in evolution. So you can see how good and evil are always relative, because whatever is good is that action or attitude that is in a chord that is in tune with the motion of the whole cosmos. If you go along with where the cosmos is going, then you are doing good. If you go against it, then you are doing something wrong. So these celestial beings were spiritual, and when to the perspective of incarnating into these material bodies and submitting themselves to matter and to reproduction and to all this, when seeing this, they said, not yet. Let us let nature to go on, to develop it more. We want to stay a little longer in a pure spiritual state. But that was not the right action, because the cycle of evolution required them to incarnate. Now, Blavatsky says that they are celestial beings, which were human beings in a previous cycle of evolution, a previous Manvantara. And then she says whether on this planet or on a previous planet, I don't know. Now, remember that both the fifth order of celestial beings and the fourth order of celestial beings are involved in the providing the bodies, the human forms, with the mind. We are the fourth, we as these Atma Buddhi Manas, this divine spark, are the fourth order of celestial beings who have to acquire experience incarnated. But also Blavatsky says that the fifth order is involved in a similar way. And as we are going to see, some of these celestial beings of the fifth order incarnated also in human beings. My impression is that, as we are going to see in the second part, those beings who refuse to incarnate are part of our own order, of the fourth celestial order. These are monads that became human in a previous evolution, maybe in a previous planetary chain or in a previous round. Becoming human means that we develop a certain mind, a certain intelligence, but not necessarily wisdom. So you have these spiritual entities with a certain level of free will and intelligence, but not with the wisdom to understand, to see the bigger picture. This is why the celestial beings have to continue their evolution by being incarnated. Once we finish the experience as a human being and reach enlightenment, then we understand the whole process, and that particular monad would not make a mistake like this. So although it is not very clear what beings were the ones that refused to incarnate, to me it makes sense that it was a group of the human souls which are now incarnated, a group of them that refuse to become more material, as we were saying. Now, this brings us also to a certain idea. Normally we tend to think of God and the angels as being perfect, as being not really related to us. They are completely different species from what we are. But that is not the point of view in the esoteric philosophy. Angels and human beings are the same kind of entities. It's just that we are experiencing the universe in different ways, as we explored or explained in the previous classes here. We are some angels that need to experience the physicality right now. There are other angels that already went through this and they have a wisdom that was acquired. And there are other angels that have not yet gone through this, and they will have to become a human being in some other cycle of evolution. So there is a continuity between celestial beings and human beings, but also all celestial beings, all the orders are evolving, are learning, are not perfect. From the point of view of the esoteric philosophy, the reason why these celestial orders are still engaged in evolution in some way or the other, whether working on the physical bodies of the human beings, or working on connecting the inner principles, or whatever they do, that is part of their learning process of developing a skill, of learning how to be a builder in the cosmos. So no celestial being is perfect. All celestial beings are in a process of learning how to do this job. Of course, the learning is a symbolic way of speaking, and there, as Blavatsky says, and we are going to see, there are some failures, but these are failures that are not going to make a planet disappear. Let's see, for example, Blavatsky says the demiurgos, and this is a Greek word that means these builders or creators that are divine. And the demiurgos is no personal deity, but only the aggregate of the Dhyan Chohans, or celestial beings, and the other forces, the elemental forces, for example. So what we call the creator, Blavatsky always refused to talk about the creator as this single being. She says the creator is a general collective name for all these forces, these creative forces in the universe. Just like when you say an army, there is not a being that is the army. The army is the collectivity of the soldiers. So the creator, the demiurgos, in Blavatsky's view, is the collectivity of the creative powers. Of course, there is one universal mind from which they all draw, and perhaps you could think of the universal mind as the creator, but this universal mind is not a separate entity. The Dhyan Chohans are entities. The universal mind is the intelligence that is built into the very fabric of the universe. So Blavatsky normally tried to avoid putting this in terms of a personal deity, as we are used to regard it in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So she says that the process of evolution is not always perfect, that process of evolution is not always perfect, and since however many proofs it may exhibit of a guiding intelligence behind the veil, it still shows gaps and flaws, and even results very often in evident failures. Therefore, neither the collective host, the demiurgos, nor any of the working powers individually are proper subjects for divine honors or worship. So she says it is true that there is a guiding, many things exhibit this guiding intelligence behind the veil. If you look at nature, there is so much intelligence behind. That is true. Now, nature is not perfect, Blavatsky says. Actually, as we are going to see in the second part, she says nature unaided fails. And she gives some examples of some failures that nature had to correct. In some cases, extinctions, when a species, there is an event of the extinction of a species, or even, a more global event, Blavatsky says these are failures that the celestial beings are trying to produce something, and then they realize that is not appropriate, and then they wipe out what they were trying to produce, and then they try again. So you see that from this point of view, evolution is a very dynamic process. It's not mechanical like in science. It's not a perfect creation like in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It's a dynamic process in which all the parts involved are learning and are acquiring a skill. So she says there are no divine entities that we should worship, although, she says, all are entitled to the grateful reverence of humanity. All these celestial beings are spiritual entities. They are playing their part. They are all entitled to the grateful reverence of humanity. And man ought to be ever striving to help the divine evolution of ideas by becoming to the best of his ability a co-worker with nature in the cyclic task. So she says ideas here with a capital I, the evolution of the divine evolution of ideas. She's probably referring to Plato's philosophy, where he says there are these divine ideas in the mind of the Logos, and evolution is the process of manifesting these ideas. So she says that humanity should be grateful to the celestial beings, but also not position himself or herself, any human being, as a lowly entity that has nothing to do with the angels or the process of evolution. We are, whether we like it or not, we are co-workers with nature. We affect, as we are all very aware right now, the climate, the weather. We affect the forests. We affect how the earth is developing. So we are co-workers with nature. And the more we evolve and the more we awaken these latent powers that are spiritual powers, because we essentially are spiritual entities, these celestial beings, as we awaken these divine powers, then we can become more and more conscious helpers of evolution. Now, thankfully, all these divine powers are latent because we still don't have the wisdom to help evolution. Actually, with the few powers that we have developed through the development of our intellect and technology and physical ability, we are not helping the planet. So it is good that all these powers are still latent. As we grow in wisdom, along with that, the powers will awaken more and more, and we will become a more effective co-worker of nature, along with all the other celestial beings. So you see, this is the picture of that the esoteric philosophy proposes, and therefore we are also a responsible part of how the earth evolves, how the animals evolve, and the other kingdoms of nature. So, having refused to create, the next shloka says, the curse is pronounced. They will be born in the fourth, and now Blavatsky adds race, suffer and cause suffering. This is the first war. So the curse is pronounced. They will be born in the fourth race, suffer and cause suffering. Blavatsky says that this phrase, the curse is pronounced, does not mean in this instance that any personal being, God or superior spirit pronounced this curse, but simply that the cause which could but create bad results had been generated, and that the effects of a karmic cause could lead the beings that counteracted the laws of nature, and thus impeded her legitimate progress, only to bad incarnations, hence to suffering. So, because of this decision, a negative karmic cause was generated that later produced suffering. We will see this more specifically later, as I keep saying. But Blavatsky says that, as we will see here, that basically the problem is that because they refused to incarnate at the right moment, the bodies that were meant for them to incarnate, they kept on reproducing themselves. But with each generation, because the bodies didn't have the guidance of the incarnated celestial being behind, with each generation, these bodies became less and less fit for a spiritual entity. So Blavatsky says, it is true that these beings have fallen, in one sense, but not through pride, only through unwillingness to imprison themselves, as I have just said, in finite, limited form. So here we see a second or a third fall. One was the correct fall of the spirit into matter to experience all the planes in the universe. The other fall is the fall of the mortal man, meaning when humanity becomes physical, the fall into physical generation and everything that this means. You have to feed yourself, you have to take care of your body. Now you are a physical being. That is a second fall. Those two falls are natural. But then there is this third fall, which are the angels that refused to engage in this process of generation. Then they fell, in the sense that they fell out of sync with evolution, so to say. Now, Blavatsky says the fall was not through pride. You know, in the Christian version, when they talk about Lucifer or Satan, the idea is that Lucifer fell from heaven because of pride, because he wanted to be like the gods, or like God in that case, and that pride made him fall. Blavatsky says no, that was not the reason. It's not that the celestial beings wanted to be like God. It's just that they wanted to remain in a spiritual state, and they were unwilling to give that up so that they would become limited by matter. So that is the reason for their fall. She says, they were gods whom the law of evolution compelled to descend into matter, that is to say, to fall. That was a natural fall that they should have followed. But instead of submitting quietly to the law and incarnating at the proper time, they delayed until man had brutalized himself in his ignorance, and thus defiled themselves and the bodies which the law compelled them to inhabit. So this is what I was saying. The part of humanity that remained devoid of a spiritual entity behind became more and more brutalized, as Blavatsky says there, and these bodies became less fit for the incarnation of a celestial being, the incarnation of a soul. And then at some point, the karmic law forced them to incarnate in these bodies that were less appropriate even than the ones that they rejected, and therefore they were very limited in their power to guide the body. The matter was too strong, the structure of the body was not good enough to receive the spiritual influence, and these human beings became evil forces in the world. But we will see that in the second part of the series. This is why it is said they will suffer and create suffering. And this is the first war. Blavatsky says there were many wars, or this is in one of the commentaries, and she says this refers to several struggles of adjustment, spiritual, cosmical, and astronomical, but chiefly to the mystery of the evolution of man as he is now. So in the previous series we saw that there were wars, in quotation marks, even in the formation of the solar system and the planets. And the idea of the war in heaven is again another religious allegory that can be applied to many levels. In this particular case, the refusal to incarnate by this group of Dhyanis is the first war in heaven when connected to the evolution of humanity. So these are the two slokas that we are bringing from the stanza 6, and now we are going to continue with stanza 7, that once all the celestial beings that had to incarnate finally incarnated, now they start evolving as human beings. And this is where the stanza 7 picks up. From the firstborn, the primitive or the first man, the thread between the silent watcher and his shadow becomes more strong and radiant with every change or reincarnation. The morning sunlight has changed into noonday glory. So the silent watcher, here is a diagram to understand the references. The silent watcher would be the triple monad, Atma Buddhi Manas. The shadow would be the personality, the physical body with its vitality and the ethereal model, and then the emotions or passions. And the thread is what unites the two. This is sometimes called by Blavatsky Antahkarana. It's a Sanskrit word that means the inner organ or the inner cause. And this is like the communication between the higher and the lower. With each incarnation, with more and more experience that is gathered by the silent watcher, the monad, and with more and more reshaping of the personality so that it is in tune with the spiritual, this thread grows and becomes more radiant with every reincarnation. So this talks about the evolution. Now, of course, here in this way of seeing it, the silent watcher seems to be different and separate from the shadow. Perhaps there is another way in which we can keep the unity, which is what Blavatsky tries to refer to in her explanation. She says, this is a sentence, or this sentence is another psychological mystery that will find its explanation in Book 2. For the present, it will suffice to say that the watcher and his shadows, the latter numbering as many as there are reincarnations for the monad, that the watcher and his shadows are one. The watcher, or the divine prototype, is at the upper rung of the ladder of being, and the shadow at the lower. So the shadow is the watcher, but in its lowest expression, and the watcher, you could say, is the shadow, but in its higher expression. So there is a continuity, there is a oneness there. So perhaps this idea of that the sun, the morning sun, becomes the radiant mid sun, can be a better allegory to keep this idea of the unity. You know, the shloka says the morning sunlight has changed into noonday glory. So maybe at the beginning of evolution, we can see the human being as having very little of the spiritual influence, being able to, to feel the sphere of consciousness of a human being. The blue representing more the material influence. And then as evolution proceeds, the spiritual influence grows more and more until we have a form that is basically a vessel or a vehicle for the spiritual influence itself. So maybe in this kind of allegory, we don't have to separate so much the higher from the lower. In any case, the 7th shloka says, "This is thy present will, set the flame to the spark. Thou art myself, my image and my shadow. I have clothed myself in thee, and thou art my Vahan, vehicle. To the day be with us, when thou shalt re-become myself and others, thyself and me. Then the builders, having donned their first clothing, descend on radiant earth and reign over men who are themselves." So let's start going through the different sentences. The day be with us, when thou shalt re-become myself and others, thyself and me. So the flame is talking to the shadow, or the silent watcher to the shadow, and say, you are me. We seem to be separate, but at the day be with us, you shall re-become myself and others, thyself and me. So he's talking about a period in evolution where there will be unity. We already explored this idea of the day be with us in the previous series. Blavatsky says the day when the spark will re-become the flame, when a human being will merge into his Dhyan Chohan. We don't need to go into that. We explained in a previous series that all our monads are sparks of a fire that is this Dhyani Buddha, the head of one of the rays of consciousness to which we belong. So there is a time where even our monad merges with this logoi, this Dhyani Buddha, this fundamental ray of consciousness. And you will re-become the flame, myself and others, thyself and me, as the stanza has it, means this. In parinirvana, when the pralaya will have reduced not only material and physical bodies, but even the spiritual egos to their original principle, the past, present, and even future humanities, like all things, will be one and the same. So at the end of the whole process of evolution, in what is called parinirvana, parinirvana is a state of absolute unity. It's a state that is beyond what we call nirvana. So at the end of the process of evolution, all differentiation will be dissolved. Not only the material differentiation, but also the spiritual differentiation. And everything will be one and the same. She says everything will have re-entered the great breath. The great breath, as we saw in the first series, is an aspect of the absolute reality. In other words, everything will be merged in Brahma, or the divine unity. So this part is of the stanza is again pointing to the fact that though there is separation and differentiation, essentially we are still one. Everything is one. And after this stage in this play that is evolution, where we all have different roles and different forms, after all this is accomplished, after the development of self-consciousness, which comes out of being part of this play, is accomplished, then everything returns to what it always was, that is this unity. Until after a period of rest, a new play begins, a new period of differentiation, where this self-consciousness can be developed further and further. And the stanza says, then the builders, having donned their first clothing, descend on radiant earth and reign over men who are themselves. So their first clothing can be interpreted in different ways. For the time being, we will interpret it in the easiest. You can think of the builders, the celestial beings, let go of their spiritual bodies, and now will assume they descend on earth and they assume a physical form. So there is this idea that there are some divine beings that, leaving behind their spiritual bodies, now come to earth and reign over men who are themselves. So Blavatsky explains the Watchers, which are a different hierarchy of beings, not these orders of beings that we were talking that have to incarnate as the soul in human beings. The Watchers belong to another order of being, and says the Watchers reign over men during the whole period of Satya Yuga. Satya Yuga is, as we are going to see next, is a Sanskrit term and can be translated as the Golden Age. So the Watchers reign over men during the whole period of the Golden Age, and the smaller subsequent cycles, yugas, down to the beginning of the third root race, the third evolutionary stage of a human being. After which stage, it is the patriarchs, heroes, and the manes, and Blavatsky refers to the Egyptian dynasties that are called the manes, the incarnated Dhyanis of a lower order add to King Menes and the human kings of other nations. All were recorded carefully. So you see that at the beginning, during the Golden Age, the gods came, took incarnation and reigned over men. After the third root race, it was a lower order of Dhyanis, of celestial beings, that incarnated to become the guides of humanity. And then later on, it was human kings. It was probably the most spiritual among the humans who guided humanity. So you see that as time passed, at the beginning there is the guidance from the gods themselves, and as time passes, then this guidance is left more and more into our own hands. So before we go into that, let's see the 4 yugas. This is, as I said, a Hindu concept. There is the idea that the Satya Yuga was the first age, the Golden Age, which according to the Vishnu Purana and the Bhagavatam, it lasted for close to 2 million years. This is the age where the gods walked among men. Now you can see in many traditions this idea of the Golden Age where the gods were among us. From the mythology in the Australian natives, to India, to the Greeks, to the Mayans here, everywhere there is this tradition of the Golden Age where the gods were among us. So something must have happened if all these different traditions that have no contact between them are saying the same. And this is what the Secret Doctrine explains. In the second part of the series, we are going to see what this means in particular. Then there was another cycle of evolution after the Satya Yuga ended, the Treta Yuga, which can be translated as the Silver Age, a little over a million years, where humanity was less spiritual, where materiality began to be stronger, and then the gods began to recede from guiding humanity, or at least the higher gods. So there were lower gods or celestial beings that were incarnated. Then the Dwapara Yuga, which is the Bronze Age, which lasts for less than 1 million years. At that point, humanity had grown quite materialistic, and probably at this point, the guides were human beings, highly evolved human beings, but not gods any longer. And then the Kali Yuga, the Iron Age, which according to this chronology lasts for over 400,000 years. This is the age in which we are right now, where the guidance is not done. Those who guide humanity are not gods, neither higher nor lower, are not spiritually enlightened people, but are the people who are greedy, materialistic, selfish. That is one of the qualities of the Kali Yuga, the Iron Age. So you can see that in humanity right now, the people who take the lead, most of them are people who are not like the philosopher king of, the Greeks, for example. So these 4 cycles compose a Mahayuga, a great cycle of over 4 million years. So let's see what Blavatsky said about this. The Secret Doctrine says that the Dhyani Buddhas, these are the highest gods, the highest celestial beings, of the 2 higher groups, namely the Watchers or the Architects, furnished the many and various races with divine kings and leaders. So this is the idea that these very high celestial beings incarnated and became the divine kings and leaders of the various races around the world. It is the latter who taught humanity their arts and sciences, and the former who revealed to the incarnated monads that had just shaken off their vehicle of the lower kingdoms from the animal kingdom, and who had therefore lost every recollection of their divine origin, they taught the great spiritual truths of the transcendental worlds. Thus, as expressed in the stanza, the watchers descended on earth and reigned over men who are themselves. So, from the point of view of the esoteric tradition, humanity didn't learn the arts, agriculture, how to read the stars, medicine. All these things were not learned by random trial and error. Humanity was never alone in the process of evolution, left to figure things out, but there were always the gods that before humanity could develop a strong mind, when humanity was like a child needs parents. So when humanity was at the beginning of evolution, we had these guiding parents. We had the gods that helped us develop all the cultures and the sciences and what to eat, what not to eat, the seasons, how to do this or that. This, as I said, is recorded in many traditions. In many traditions, native traditions, they have a collective remembrance of this by means of their myths and stories. And they do talk about gods coming down to earth and teaching us. There is a story also that some scientists were talking to some native shamans, and they saw that the shamans knew very well what herbs to use for when a bone was broken or when there was some stomachache or this or that. And then these scientists asked the shaman, how did you figure out all this? And the shaman said, we go to the inner world, in our tradition, we go to the inner world. Sometimes the gods teach us, or sometimes they come to our dreams in the dream world, and you may have a god that comes and tell you what to use for what, or some nature spirit. So this is even at the beginning of humanity, the gods were in direct contact with us. As they receded, then they could be accessed on the inner planes by the shamans, by people who had a special sensitivity to all this. But then as we became more and more material, for most of us, even that avenue of communication is closed. So now if we have to figure something out, we have to figure that out by scientific means, by this very slow and tedious process of experimentation, half understanding what we are doing, assuming many things that are not correct. So science is constantly trying to correct itself. All this is not effective at all. It was far more effective to learn from, the gods or the spirits of nature. But this is part of the natural process. We have isolated ourselves from nature. Now we have to figure out how to do things by ourselves. And that is what also, even though we do blunder here and there, in this effort, we realize, we learn and evoke the potential wisdom and powers that are in every human being.